The jar in your spice cabinet may be a forgery. It looks right. It smells vaguely right. The threads are red. The label reads Spanish saffron, product of La Mancha. You paid $18 for half a gram, but a UK investigation found that between 40 and 90% of what is sold under that name in Europe and North America contains almost no saffron at all. Corn fibers soaked in food dye, calendula petals, safflower stigmas, sometimes dyed silk, sometimes paper. Scientists testing commercial samples found that up to 30% of the global saffron supply is adulterated, with rates reaching 60% in some markets. You paid the price of gold and received something closer to yard waste. What makes this fraud possible is a monopoly so complete that no outside force has ever successfully broken it. One country controls more than 90% of the world's supply. Entire nations buy in bulk, relabel it with their own flags, and sell it at a premium without growing a single corm themselves. Spain exported 287,000 kilograms of saffron in 2019. Its domestic production that year was 1,537 kilograms. The math is not an error. And the spice at the center of all of it, the one being stolen, diluted, and faked on an industrial scale, carries within its 3 tiny threads more clinical evidence for treating depression than most things your doctor can prescribe. Welcome to Nature's Lost Vault. The archive opens on the Aegean island of Santorini, in the ruins of a city called Akrotiri. A volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE buried the settlement in ash and preserved it perfectly. When archaeologists uncovered the frescoes in the 1960s, they found something unexpected. Painted across the palace walls was a detailed scene. Women in elaborate robes crouching over low-growing purple flowers, carefully plucking 3 red threads from each bloom. A goddess watching over the harvest. Another woman using the gathered threads to treat a wound on her foot. These are the oldest botanically accurate images of medicinal plant use ever found. The plant was Crocus sativus, saffron. The Minoan civilization did not stumble onto it. They cultivated it deliberately, bred specifically for the length of its stigmas, handed down as an act of human intention. Before that, the Sumerians gathered it from wild fields, believing its medicine could only come from divine intervention. Ancient Persian royal carpets have been found with saffron threads woven directly through them. In Isfahan, 1,000 years before the Common Era, Persian kings were already maintaining dedicated cultivation fields. They mixed it into hot tea as a cure for melancholy. They used it to treat wounds. Saffron threads scattered across beds were thought to prevent depression. They called it zarparan, gold strung. When Alexander the Great's armies crossed into Persia, his soldiers began using saffron-infused baths to close their wounds. He adopted the practice himself. The tea was drunk on campaign for endurance. What they understood intuitively, modern pharmacology would eventually confirm in double-blind, randomized controlled trials. But that confirmation would take 3.5 millennia to arrive, and by the time it did, the supply chain had been captured. By the 14th century, the demand for saffron in Europe had become so extreme that when a shipment of 800 pounds was intercepted en route to the city of Basel, Switzerland, the theft triggered a war that lasted 14 weeks. The cargo, worth over $500,000 at today's prices, was eventually returned, but the incident became known as the Saffron War of 1374. Cities began posting guards at saffron fields. Basel planted its own corms and posted armed guards at the city gates to prevent anyone from removing them. What drove this kind of desperation? Saffron was not seasoning. It was medicine. It was dye. It was currency. In 1370, at the height of the Black Death, European demand exploded because physicians believed saffron could treat the plague. Farmers who might have grown it were dying alongside their crops. Supply collapsed. Prices went vertical. Merchants who controlled the trade routes wielded a kind of power that could not be matched by armies. Around 1730, Pennsylvania Dutch settlers carried saffron corms to America in a trunk. Within years, they were selling it to Spanish colonists in the Caribbean at a price the Philadelphia Commodity Exchange set equal to gold. But the War of 1812 destroyed most of the merchant ships carrying American saffron abroad. The trade never recovered. The corms remained in Pennsylvania gardens, but the market was gone. Meanwhile, global trade reorganized itself around Persia, the region that would become modern Iran. By the 20th century, Iran's Khorasan province produced more than 90% of the world's saffron. This was not a cartel in the formal sense. No board meeting, no signed agreement, just geography, climate, tradition, and accumulated expertise concentrated in a single country that happened to become one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on Earth. When US and European sanctions hit Iran, the saffron could not be sold under its own name into Western markets. So it moved through intermediaries. Iranian farmers sold in bulk to traders in Spain, the UAE, and Afghanistan. The traders repackaged the product. Spanish saffron, premium Italian threads. Certified origin. All of it Iranian. The legal loophole was simple. Spain's labeling laws allowed importers to package foreign saffron domestically and market it as a product of Spain. In 2019, Spain exported 187 times more saffron than it grew. The fraud compounded at the next layer. With this much money moving through a system with no purity standards, the adulteration became systematic. The FDA acknowledges saffron fraud specifically, but it has established no purity standard for the spice. There is no legal definition in the United States of what percentage of a jar labeled saffron must actually be saffron. Into that vacuum moved the industrial adulterants. Corn stigmas soaked in beet juice, safflower petals dried and pressed, turmeric mixed into saffron powder to mimic color. The most dangerous substitutes are the synthetic dyes used to make cheap material pass visual inspection. Sudan dyes and rhodamine B have both been found in commercial saffron samples. Both are considered potentially carcinogenic. You are paying for medicine and receiving a dye job. Here is what the real thing does. In 2005, a randomized, double-blind clinical trial published in a peer-reviewed journal compared saffron extract to fluoxetine, the active compound in Prozac, for treating mild to moderate depression. Patients took 30 milligrams of saffron per day for 6 weeks. The results showed no statistically significant difference between saffron and fluoxetine. A subsequent meta-analysis reviewed 5 independent clinical trials and found a massive effect size for saffron versus placebo, comparable antidepressant efficacy versus both fluoxetine and imipramine, and no severe adverse events reported in any of the trials. The mechanism is not vague. Crocin and saffronal, the bioactive compounds responsible for saffron's color and aroma, inhibit the reuptake of serotonin in the synapses. This is the exact same mechanism exploited by the entire selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor category, often abbreviated SSRI. They also modulate dopamine. They stimulate the production of BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor that governs neurogenesis and memory consolidation. A 2025 review identified that crocatin inhibits acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. That is the precise mechanism of the frontline Alzheimer's drugs donepezil and rivastigmine. A natural spice used for 3,500 years as a treatment for melancholy turns out to operate on the same molecular targets as the pharmaceutical industry's most prescribed products. The global selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor market generates $15 billion per year. The Alzheimer's drug market is worth another $8 billion. And growing in every garden that will accept it is a small autumn flowering corm that most people have never tried to cultivate because they assume it is exotic and rare and impossible to grow outside the mountains of Persia. It is not. Crocus sativus grows in USDA zones 3 to 9. That is almost the entire continental United States. In warmer zones, the corms go directly in the ground. In colder climates, they grow in containers that come indoors before the first hard freeze. The plant requires almost nothing: full sun, well-drained soil, and water only after planting and during active growth. It will not tolerate wet feet, but it tolerates cold, drought, neglect, and poor soil with remarkable patience. Plant in September or October. The corms go in 3 to 4 inches deep, pointed end up, 4 inches apart. In 6 to 8 weeks, purple flowers appear. Each flower carries 3 red stigmas. You pick them in the morning when the bloom is fully open, dry them on a paper towel for 2 days, and store them in a glass jar out of the light. 50 flowers produce roughly a teaspoon of dried saffron. 1 teaspoon is enough to flavor a paella for 8 people, brew weeks of medicinal tea, or add to a glass of warm milk every morning for a month of documented mood support. The corms multiply underground on their own. Year 1, you have 20 corms. Year 3, you have 80. Year 5, you have enough to share with your neighborhood and still harvest more than you can use. The woman in the Minoan fresco, crouching in an elaborate robe at Akrotiri 3,600 years ago, plucking 3 red threads from a purple flower and carrying them to a wound, understood something that a $15 billion pharmaceutical industry has spent decades obscuring. The threads do something. They do it reliably. The science exists, backed by 2 decades of modern clinical study. But the threads in your spice cabinet are probably not the threads that do it. That is the fraud. Not dramatic. Not a boardroom conspiracy. Just a system built on inaccessibility, on the assumption that the real thing can only come from 9,000 miles away, from a sanctioned country through intermediaries, at prices that make counterfeiting extremely profitable. The answer is not to boycott the supply chain. It is to step outside it entirely. Plant 20 corms this September. By November, you will have harvested your first threads. They will be the color of old blood, intensely fragrant, unlike anything sold in a jar. You will know exactly what they are because you watched them grow. 3 stigmas per flower. 3 flowers to make a cup of tea. 3 cups a week for 6 weeks in a clinical trial that matched Prozac. The math is not complicated. The corms are available from reputable bulb suppliers for less than the price of a single jar of the adulterated product you currently have in your cabinet. Thousands of years ago, a woman on a Greek island painted evidence of this on a palace wall, and the earth preserved it. The knowledge was never lost. It was just priced out of your reach and then quietly replaced with a forgery. Plant the corm. Harvest in the morning. Dry on a paper towel. Use what you grew. If this vault changed how you see your own spice cabinet, do not let this knowledge disappear again. Subscribe to Nature's Lost Vault and hit the notification bell. Every like and every share helps us bypass the algorithm and preserve what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.